Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Karen Greenberg. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. We are delighted to be bringing you this afternoon's conversation. With me today is Chris Whipple, award-winning author, journalist, documentary maker. His new book is The Spymasters. Can you see it? How the CIA directors shape history and the future. And we're going to talk a lot about this book today. But first, I just want to say welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So this is actually a wonderful read. When I started it, I was sort of like, oh no, this is going to be too much information. I won't be able to take it in. It's fantastic. It's based on, in addition to your own knowledge and research, it's based on over 70 interviews. And you've interviewed among those the directors of the CIA, the living directors of the CIA, except for the current one. And it's really not so, I'm just going to say it out there. It's not so much about the CIA directors as about the CIA directors and the relationship to the White House and the president. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words about the book, because one of the things I've really tried to do, maybe above all else, is to humanize these directors. And I was lucky because it's a cast of characters that John le Carré never could have dreamt up. You know, from Dick Helms back in the 60s, who was the quintessential CIA director. Bob Gates described him to me as a James Bondian character, cigarette in one hand, a dry martini in the other, who could walk into the Oval Office and tell LBJ that the domino theory was flawed. And then going forward to, you know, through Bill Colby, who to me was kind of the Vito Corleone of the CIA. And then you've got Bill Casey, and you've got an amazing cast of characters, all the way up to Gina Haspel, the first woman to run the CIA. But you're right that the book focuses a lot on that relationship between the president and the CIA director. It's an almost impossible balancing act for a CIA director, because he or she, on the one hand, has to tell the president hard truths while also keeping the president's ear. That's a really tough challenge, even in the best of times. And in the current times, it's practically mission impossible.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw the Comey film over the weekend.
Not yet, but recorded it, yeah.
But it's one of the things that becomes clear, how hard that particular relationship is just generally, and how much harder it was under Trump. So just going down that line a little bit, so who had the worst relationship? And I read the book, so I kind of think I know what you're going to say. And then who had the best relationship? And it's a spectrum, I understand.
No, Jim Woolsey would have to be a candidate for worst relationship with the president. Woolsey, again, a really fascinating character to me, brilliant guy. He was, as we all know, on a spectrum, on an ideological spectrum, he was well over to the right. But he loved to joke about the fact that he was president of Yale Students for Eugene McCarthy back in '68. He opposed the Vietnam War, not for the reasons McCarthy did, but because he thought it was winnable, we weren't doing enough. Anyway, he becomes CIA director, but Bill Clinton and Woolsey were like oil and water, as one source put it to me. Clinton just did not like him. After the first briefing, which went on and on, evidently at some length, Woolsey left. Bill Clinton turned to one of his advisors and said, "I'd never want to see that man again." And he almost never did. Woolsey had literally one meeting with the president. And at one point, there was a freak accident on the south lawn of the White House. A small plane crashed and killed the pilot. Afterwards, Woolsey said to the press, "That was me trying to get an appointment with Bill Clinton."
Oh my God.
So it was not a very productive relationship. And Woolsey met his demise over the Aldrich Ames scandal. Ames, that case, the most serious mole since Kim Philby, probably, in American intelligence history. in intelligence history happened on his watch, and it essentially ended his tenure.
And what about the best relationship?
There would be a number of contenders for that, probably. I would say that Bob Gates and George H.W. Bush had a very good relationship. Leon Panetta and Barack Obama had a very good relationship. John Brennan and Obama, certainly. Here's sort of a spoiler alert. For those who know that I wrote another book called The Gatekeepers about the White House chiefs of staff. Some of the attributes that make a great White House chief of staff also serve CIA directors well. And it's no coincidence, in my view, that Leon Panetta was the gold standard at both. There were certainly other great White House chiefs and other great CIA directors, but Panetta was right up there with the best in both jobs. And that's partly because had a lot to do with the fact that Panetta, when he became CIA director for Obama, he was 70 years old. He'd been around the block. He'd served in Congress. He was comfortable in the corridors of power. He knew the White House, and he could walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell Barack Obama what he didn't want to hear. And that's essential in both jobs.
Yeah, you portray him as being not just an honest broker, but like a brilliant strategist for sort of.
He was. And one of the great infighting stories that I tell in the Leon Panetta chapter is about the time that poor Denny Blair, who was then the director of national intelligence, made the mistake of trying to take on Leon Panetta in a bureaucratic struggle over who would appoint the CIA station chiefs. Well, I guess you could on paper make the argument that the director of national intelligence outranked Leon, and therefore Denny Blair ought to make that appointment. But in the real world, Blair should have known that was turf that was jealously guarded at Langley. Panetta knew that, and Blair sent out a directive without informing Panetta to all the stations, saying that Denny Blair, would be appointing the new station chiefs. Well, Panetta waited about a half hour and sent out another message to all the stations saying, disregard the previous message. Well, this was not a fair fight. This went to the White House, but Leon knew exactly who had his back on this one. Not only Barack Obama, but Vice President Joe Biden, who wound up being the referee on this one. Mm-hmm. And as they walked into the office to adjudicate this with Biden, Leon turned to him and said, Joe, is our tea time still 9:30 tomorrow? And Biden said yes. And Blair knew he was a dead man walking.
Yeah. This book is not just about the White House, the presidents, the CIA directors, but it's also a chronicle of American foreign policy. And not just things we're learning from behind the scenes, but just the major events that have taken place in American foreign policy over 4 to 5 decades. And a number of those things obviously have been on our minds lately, 9/11 being, perhaps the most obvious one, but the killing of bin Laden. But there was one incident that I think a lot of readers and our audience won't know that much about. And that is that of Imad Mughniyeh. And I just wondered if you wanted to tell that story, because I don't know how others listening feel, but I felt like I'm so embarrassed I don't know this story. And so I'm so grateful that I know this story. So tell us.
No, don't be embarrassed, because a lot of people don't know it. And in fact, the first half of the story that I tell in the book about Imad Mughniyeh has never been reported before. It's an absolutely unbelievable story that it lasts for 3 or 4 decades. Imad Mughniyeh was far and away the most wanted terrorist in the Middle East by both the CIA and Mossad, going all the way back to the worst day in CIA history, which was the bombing of the embassy in Beirut, which killed so many CIA officers and other Americans at the time. Well, subsequently, it was determined that this was probably a Mughniyeh operation. It was the dawn of course, that whole era of truck bomb terrorism. That was really the beginning. It was a really pivotal time. And from that day forward, Mughniyeh had more American and Israeli blood on his hands than anyone. He was the operational genius of Hezbollah, the operational chief. They called him the Scarlet Pimpernel of terrorism because he was so elusive. They literally had one grainy photograph of him, the CIA, and they could never keep up with him. He would wear disguises. He developed, pioneered the use of a so-called shaped charge, a kind of sophisticated IED that really essentially drove the Israelis out of Lebanon at the end. It was that effective and lethal, and it would cut through a tank. And he killed a famous Israeli general, triggering the Israeli withdrawal. In short, he was the most wanted guy. And the other two most wanted guys were a General Suleiman of Syria and an Iranian general named Soleimani, whose name may ring a bell since he was killed in January of this year. In any event, the CIA tried to track down Mughniyeh. And I tell the story of an operation on Bill Clinton's watch at the end of his presidency, on George Tenet's watch as CIA director, in which they tracked him down to Beirut. They discovered he was visiting his mistress's flat, and he would visit her and he would beat her. As it turned out, the CIA enlisted her to set him up and grab him and bundle him down to the dock and onto a boat and off to a battleship offshore. It all went south. The operation failed. And another decade went by before the CIA finally tracked him down in Damascus. Excuse me. So I tell that story in hair-raising detail, how in a joint CIA Mossad operation, they finally got Mughniyeh, tracked him as he was driving around Damascus in his luxurious SUV. They decided that they couldn't plant the bomb in a phone. He discarded phones too often, but he always had his SUV. And they wound up, the CIA building a bomb. It was a technical marvel because they had to replace the whole back door of the SUV without Mughniyeh or his bodyguards noticing, and had to match the paint color exactly, even the age of the paint job. They did all this, and Mossad wound up pulling the trigger. And at one point, at one moment, while they were surveilling Mughniyeh and waiting for the moment to strike, they looked and looked again and realized that the guy, someone leaning on his car talking with Mughniyeh, was, guess who? General Soleimani. And they thought, my God, it's a twofer. We can take them both out. Well, they sent word back for permission. Permission was denied. Mughniyeh was the only legitimate target. They waited, and Soleimani went off, and they finally did get Mughniyeh. So it's just an unbelievable story. The whole, and also the whole delicate negotiation, because assassination, quote unquote, has always been a fraught proposition at the CIA. It's been prohibited by executive orders, including 12333, for decades. In this case, they went through contortions so that the Israelis would pull the trigger rather than the Americans. Bush signed off on the deal as long as nobody ever talked about it. And nobody does talk about it to this day, except in part to me for this chapter that I wrote in the book.
Yeah, I mean, you have a whole page where you excerpt from your interviews where you ask a number of CIA directors what happened, and it's just no comment, no comment, no comment, which I guess comes with the territory, but it's not a bad story to eventually get to know. I have a question.
Can I just add that at the end, your very own, Fordham's very own John Brennan, who finally got frustrated with me asking him repeatedly for a comment on what happened to McNeil. He finally looked at me and he said, he died quickly, period. That was his comment.
And that's more than you got from any of the others. So it's interesting.
Many of the other directors.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask that you don't, at least you don't really talk about, and I'd love your thoughts on, is the use of military generals to be head of the CIA, and whether you know how we should think about that and how others have thought about that, you know, thinking of General Petraeus, General Hayden, and just kind of like, because there is a way in which these are distinct authorizations for using force, for using covert activity, and just what did you learn about that particular, you know, that mixing of kind of expertises?
Well, it's a mixed bag. It's been, and the two, of course, the two directors that I get into it with are Mike Hayden and David Petraeus. Each of them really capable and really interesting characters. And Hayden tells the story about how he first, when he arrived, he'd run the NSA, of course, National Security Agency prior. He was still a general, not quite retired, when he arrived at the CIA. And he went to the bubble, the so-called bubble, the auditorium at the CIA on his to make his first address to the troops, as it were. And as he was speaking, when he came to the end of his remarks, he took questions, and somebody's hand shot up and they said, "What would you like us to call you?" And Hayden, who is famously eloquent and glib and articulate, was thrown for a minute. He didn't know how to answer. And finally, he just said, "Whatever makes you comfortable. Don't call me general. Call me whatever you want to call me." And he said, in retrospect, it was the most important thing he said that day. There is what some wags at CIA call something called 4-star general disease. And what it means is that military people sometimes arrive at the CIA, and certainly directors have arrived on occasion with a very well-developed sense of entitlement, used to having a staff of 50 people to, as David Petraeus did when he was in Afghanistan, to cater to his every whim. And this was a little bit of a problem for Petraeus when he arrived. It was just a culture shock. They're just different cultures. And when you've been a commanding general like Petraeus, you're accustomed to a different way of life and way of operating and having people at your beck and call. Petraeus got over that, and I think adjusted to the CIA culture. But in the beginning, it was rocky for him. He had only just really adjusted to CIA culture when, of course, he met his untimely demise by sharing classified information with his mistress, Paula Broadwell. And in the book, I ask him point blank about that. And it's fascinating, I have to say.
Yeah, and you use an excerpt from her, which I thought was also very interesting, and that can be a teaser for the for reading that section of the book. What about when directors are asked or told by presidents to break the law? What did you learn about that process and how that plays out, looking at all of these different directors and their relationships with presidents?
To me, that might be the most fascinating theme in the book.
Yeah.
Because it's a continuous theme that from the beginning, all the way up to our current CIA director, Gina Haspel. And I had the privilege of getting to know the widow of Richard Helms, the previously mentioned quintessential CIA, old school CIA director. Cynthia died last summer, but I spent a lot of time with her right the summer before. She was 95 and she was full of terrific untold stories about her husband. And she said, you know, Chris, they were all asked to do things they shouldn't have done. And I said, like what? And we got into it and we talked about the fact that Helms was a flawed character. He was brilliant and he was smooth and he was, I love the stories about him holding his own on a dance floor with Fred Astaire at the 1975 state dinner for the Shah of Iran. Helms was dancing with Cynthia and Fred Astaire was dancing with the Shah Banu of Iran. Quite a character, but flawed. His relationship with LBJ is fascinating because he admired LBJ for his domestic achievements and the Great Society. He was exasperated by the Vietnam War. But he wanted LBJ to succeed. And LBJ leaned on him very hard, as only LBJ could do, and told him in no uncertain terms that he wanted intelligence showing that domestic protesters against the Vietnam War were being controlled by foreign communist powers. Mm-hmm. Helms protested, said that's not in the CIA charter, and LBJ said, I'm well aware of that, I want it. He wanted the intelligence. Well, Helms should have known better, but he bent the law. I mean, he set up an operation called Operation MH Chaos. It was illegal domestic surveillance of protesters who had every right to protest. And at the end of the day, he came up with absolutely no evidence of any foreign communist control. So Helms was flawed, but at the end of the day, Helms stood up to Nixon at the most important time. And when the crunch came during the Watergate scandal, and H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's White House chief of staff, called him into the White House and told him famously to shut down the FBI investigation into Watergate, Helms was having none of it. And he stood up for the rule of law and he arguably saved the CIA. So Helms is the earliest example of a CIA director who had to deal with that kind of pressure. But so many of them have had to. And time and again, presidents will ask them to do stuff they shouldn't be doing, including, I love the way Bob Gates put it, but Gates said that, usually you've got a really difficult problem. The State Department says, let the military handle it. The military says, let the diplomats handle it. And then they all say, well, let's let the CIA do it. CIA is, one former director told me that you could never get rid of the CIA, never abolish it, because presidents would have no one to blame. So the fact of the matter over the last 5 or 6 decades is that when the CIA gets in trouble, it's usually because presidents have asked them to do stuff they shouldn't be doing.
Do they get in trouble?
Do they get in trouble?
Yeah, you said when the CIA, I mean, do they actually get held accountable or get in trouble, or is it?
Well, they've certainly been, it's certainly been blamed time and again. The other classic lament out at Langley, which I love, is in this town, there are only policy successes and intelligence failures. Certainly, CIA was blamed for 9/11. It was called a failure of imagination. It was called all kinds of things, but basically the CIA was, as Cofer Black, George Tenet's deputy, said, people would come up to me, congressmen would come up to me and say, hey, Cofer, how does it feel to have the worst intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor? The truth is, and I have a really detailed chapter on this, in July of 2001, George Tenet, Cofer Black, and Rich Blee, who was head of the Al-Qaeda unit, went over to the Bush White House. Cofer slammed his fist on the table, said, "We've got to go on a war footing now." They met with Condi Rice. Essentially, they blew the whistle and nobody heard it. This was a case, this was, in my view, less of an intelligence failure and more of a policy failure. It was a White House failure to heed their warnings. Fast forward to 2020, and we are now suffering the catastrophic consequences of a president who ignored warnings in his President's Daily Brief throughout the month of January, and 200,000 Americans are dead.
One of the things you talk about that sort of goes through both those stories, which is just a little different, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, is the abandonment of norms, procedural norms under this president, particularly in terms of the principals, committee meetings, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a thread you talk about throughout. It just doesn't come out of the blue when you're talking about the Trump presidency and the CIA. Yeah,
this is a White House that not only has declared war on process and on norms, this is a White House that essentially declared war on governing from day one. I'll never forget Dennis McDonough, the outgoing White House Chief of Staff for Obama, telling me that when the clock struck noon on January 20th, he was sitting in his office waiting for Reince Priebus, the Chief of Staff, and his staff to arrive, and nobody showed up. And he waited an hour or more and finally just turned off the lights and left. To me, that's a metaphor for this presidency. But it's not the first time that process and norms have been abandoned. And one case in point is 9/11. And let's go back to that for a second, because one of the things that I learned in the book, I did a documentary in 2015 for Showtime, by the way, called The Spymasters, in which we told the story of that July 10 meeting, July 10, 2001. In the book, I was able to go deeper and talk to a number of really persuasive sources in the White House and CIA who said essentially that all you had to do in July of 2001 was call a principals meeting. And of course, principals meeting being the heads of CIA, FBI, vice president or national security advisor, and all of those department heads, and you get them around a table and you shake the trees. When you shake the trees with all of those people at the table, stuff falls out. Yeah. And a number of people told me that they think that had Condi Rice called a principals meeting, that they would have discovered that 2 of the Al-Qaeda hijackers were on US soil and had been for months. This was as we all know, a failure to communicate between CIA and FBI, but that's the kind of stuff that gets found out when you go through that kind of process. So this is not the first presidency. Trump's is not the first presidency to fail to follow some of those norms. And in this case, in the case of the Bush White House, frankly, they were living in a kind of time warp. They just couldn't believe that a bunch of guys with beards in caves in Afghanistan were going to blow up the World Trade Center. As Cofer Black put it to me memorably, he said, they thought terrorists were a bunch of Euro lefties, stay up all night, drink champagne, and blow stuff up during the day. That was the 70s mentality.
But there were people warning you, as you pointed out, and Richard Clarke famously tried to get that message to the National Security Council and the president. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the things that we haven't quite absorbed as a country yet, and that we need to reflect on, as you say so well, the war on governance, the war on government. Another thread that goes through the book, and this is, less abstract, is Iran. Every director, time and time again, has to deal with Iran almost always in a crisis situation or more than one crisis situation, right? The hostages, Iran-Contra, now Soleimani, and others. So I don't know exactly how to ask this question, but I want to know, like, where do you think and in what period of time do you think we had the best understanding of and relationship with Iran?
Well, we certainly had a very close relationship with the wrong guy in Iran, the Shah of Iran, as he turned out to be. And that's one of my favorite chapters in the book because, again, poor Stansfield Turner, it happened on his watch as CIA director, but it was arguably the greatest intelligence failure of the 20th century. Bay of Pigs was certainly a huge fiasco, but in terms of intelligence failures, quote unquote, failure to see that the Shah of Iran was as weak as he was in late 1979 and on the verge of collapse was just a fiasco. And one of the reasons, quite frankly, we had almost willfully blinded ourselves, and part of that was because Henry Kissinger had cut a deal with the Shah in which he basically said, if you'll give us access to your listening posts on the Soviet Union, we will look the other way. We will not pay any attention to your political opponents, and we simply relied on the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, for all of our intelligence. So I get into all of this in the book, and that whole relationship between Stan Turner and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter and all of that, to me, is really fascinating. But one of the caveats about all of this, I suppose, is one of the great sources I spoke to was Stu Eisenstein, just a brilliant guy. Some of you may know him. He's still very active and a really persuasive voice on foreign affairs, and wrote a book on Carter recently that was terrific. Eisenstadt was saying that our intelligence was just terrible during this whole period, and that we often just completely misunderstand other societies. And this was a classic example, and certainly Vietnam before Iran was a classic example of us just not understanding the society. But at the end of the day, you also have to wonder, if we had known that the Shah was on the verge of collapse, what would policymakers have done with that knowledge? What exactly could we have done to have changed that pivotal moment in history? Would there have been any way to have arrived at some modus vivendi with the Ayatollah? I'm not sure the odds are all that great that we would have been smart enough to figure out what to do. And I'm a great George Packer fan, by the way. I loved his book, Our Man, on Richard Holbrooke, who was my first boss, by the way, about the human, just about how badly we have misunderstood so many of these conflicts, from Vietnam to Iran to Bosnia to our current situation. So we are obviously, human beings are terribly flawed, and diplomats are as well.
So are you suggesting there's not much of a learning curve?
Well, I think the CIA is probably much more capable today than it was in 1979. And there was certainly a lot of, no offense to anybody who went to this school as I did, but it was considered all white male and Yale for decades. And diversity was certainly a huge problem at the CIA. And I think it helped to blind the CIA in many ways. I mean, I think that we've been historically for many, many decades failed to understand these other cultures, and lack of diversity was certainly a part of that. And that's vastly improved now. And I think the CIA has improved in many other ways too.
Interesting. I just want to tell everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, whichever you like, and I will work them. I've worked a few into the conversation already, but I will work them in. I have another question that kind of speaks to the evolution of the CIA, which is more structural, and that is the DNI. The ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, creation of post 9/11 reorganization of government to enhance the intelligence and national security priorities and abilities of the country. It meant that the director of the CIA was not the head of the intelligence community the way it sort of was understood to function before. What do you make of that? And what do other CIA directors make of that?
Well, funny story about that, because I was fortunate, very lucky when my book was launched. I had a Zoom party and John Brennan and Jim Clapper attended by Zoom. And I was asked this question about the DNI and what I thought of it. And I proceeded to say that, after 9/11, Congress essentially felt that it had to meddle in the intelligence community and do something. And so they created this office called the Director of National Intelligence, and essentially it muddled lines of authority and confused everyone. At which point, Jim Clapper's screen started pulsating, and he started waving his hand, and he jumped in and defended the restructuring of the intelligence community, and of course the DNI office that he occupied. And then Brennan came in and jumped on me too and said he could never have run the CIA. It was a 24/7 job without having someone like Jim Clapper to take care of, coordinate all the other intelligence services. And I finally conceded that they have a point. It really, I do think that relationship worked with Jim Clapper as DNI and John Brennan as CIA director, because they figured out how to make it work. And Clapper was the perfect guy in that job, in my opinion, as DNI. He didn't want to step on Brennan's toes as CIA directors. He wanted to help by coordinating the other agencies and leaving Brennan to do his job as he saw fit. And it worked. They got along. It was very rocky in the beginning. And I gave an example of Leon Panetta and Denny Blair earlier, where in the beginning, quite frankly, when the DNI showed up at Langley, it was like he was greeted as a Visigoth at the gates. This was, nobody at CIA wanted to be meddled with by the DNI. But it's a system, a restructuring that is working much more successfully now, I think, than it used to. The problem, of course, now, currently, is that we have a director of national intelligence, in my opinion, John Ratcliffe, who is a partisan hack, who, frankly, is really been serving the president's partisan purposes rather than being an honest broker of intelligence. So that is a serious problem.
We have a lot of questions, but one is about torture, and which you talk about enhanced interrogation techniques, as you refer to it in your book. And you talk about it a lot. And I guess my question is, how now do you see the CIA's reflection on that period of time and what happened? And do you think there's a general sense that, no, it was illegal and we shouldn't have gone there, and maybe we won't do it again? What's your thought?
Well, first of all, when I refer to those techniques as enhanced interrogation techniques, I'm simply using what the CIA's term was. It's not the term I would use. And Mark Mazzetti gave me a hard time in a review for Graydon Carter's magazine Airmail for supposedly referring to it that way. what's fascinating to me is that, first of all, Michael Hayden said to me in a quote that later became famous, but he first said it to me for our documentary, that if a president wants to waterboard anybody ever again, he'd better bring his own bucket, because this agency isn't going down that road again. And I think he's right. For one thing, it's illegal. In my view, it should be illegal. In my view, it's immoral. It's not something that the United States of America should be doing. If you talk to David Petraeus, who has some experience with, who was in charge of more detainees probably than anyone on the face of the earth as head of CENTCOM, he'll tell you that the way you get information is by having interrogators bond with their subjects, and you don't get it. You don't get effective intelligence through torture. Having said that, I felt that it was important to get inside the heads of the directors on whose watch that took place. And if you talk to George Tenet, he will give you an impassioned argument that he believed that these techniques were the only way to prevent what he thought was a second wave of attacks that were imminent after 9/11. Though that second wave of attacks never occurred, he would argue that some of the techniques did produce intelligence that disrupted plots and saved lives. And Mike Morrell, to cite another acting director, not exactly an arch conservative, the odds-on favorite to become Hillary Clinton's CIA director. Mike Morrell will tell you that there is no question in his mind that so-called enhanced interrogation techniques provided actionable intelligence that resulted in the apprehension of terrorists. And he gives specific examples. Morrell's not arguing, therefore, that we should be doing it anymore, but he's simply saying that it's not as simple as it's been portrayed. And the last thing I'll just say about it is that the Senate Majority Report, which was so damning and in many ways very thorough and convincing about the inefficacy, if you will, of those techniques, they never interviewed any of the directors on whose watch it happened. That George Tenet, Michael Hayden, Porter Goss, none of them were interviewed. So if you want to get a sense of what those directors were thinking inside their heads, you can find it in my chapter, The Spymasters.
Right. In addition to being illegal, the immoral part, we should probably mention that part. A number of people have asked about our relationship with other powers. And I think that, like, starting right now with Trump and our relationship with the Five Eyes or with the rest of the world is one of the questions. And another question that can be bundled with that is, what about, have you talked to these directors about, activities that are with non-allied powers? It's my best way of paraphrasing this. And just sort of, how does the CIA see its position in the world vis-a-vis what risks it's been willing to take over time to deal with foreign powers? And then the question of, what about our relationship with other, our coordination of intelligence sources, services, et cetera, in the current context?
It's a tough question. It's a good question. It's a very hard question to answer, particularly because we have a CIA director currently who flies under the radar, gives no interviews, is really very much, she was trained as a covert operative. It seems to be in her DNA, and she doesn't talk a lot about what they're doing. I wish that she and Mike Pompeo had given me interviews for the book. Because I believe that the CIA director has to be the honest broker of intelligence, not only to the president, but to the American people, and that CIA directors should give interviews. The really great ones weren't afraid of tough questions. The Richard Helmses and the Panettas and the Bob Gateses. So that's my little speech about their unwillingness to give interviews. Having said that, it's hard to know very much about how much the Trump era has affected the CIA's relationships with the Five Eyes. Gina Haspel has a very close relationship with British intelligence. She was a two-time station chief in London. And and I have a great story in the book about how she when she was rising through the ranks, Haspel formed a friendship with the unlikeliest mentor imaginable, and that was Jose Rodriguez, the architect of the black sites and the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. He became her sort of feminist mentor. He was the one who would say to her, when she was thinking about becoming station chief in Geneva, he would say to her, "Listen, girl, that's not good enough for you. You've got to go to London. That's where it's happening if you want to advance your career." And she did. So a little digression there, but I do think British intelligence and the CIA have a pretty good relationship. Hard to know with the others, and hard to know what the effect of the Trump presidency has been. But we all remember the time that Donald Trump met in the Oval Office with Russian officials, including Lavrov, and he blurted out details about a very sensitive Israeli operation in the Middle East. There is real concern among allies and other countries that this president can't be trusted with intelligence. That's simply a fact. As I wrote in the Washington Post, there are other big problems, which is that this president is essentially unbriefable. He doesn't read the president's daily brief. He's incurious. He thinks he knows everything worth knowing. And he thinks he can share stuff with the Vladimir Putins of the world. That's a problem. I will tell you that, Bob Woodward reports that that Dan Coates was concerned that this president, that Russia might have something on this president. I can simply tell you that Coates is hardly alone among very high-ranking intelligence officials who believe the same thing. And especially after Helsinki, I had one person who used to run Russian operations for the CIA tell me that after that press conference in Helsinki, he could think of no other rational possibility, except that the Russians have some sort of compromat or financial relationship with Trump. So none of that is a good thing when it comes to the CIA's relations with other intelligence services.
We have a ton of questions, but two of them I just want to give to you together that aren't necessarily related, but you'll relate them, which is that have to do with now. And one of them is China, which is not a huge part of what you've written about. How do you see China in terms of the extra burden it puts on the CIA for right now? How robust do you think the CIA is in order to handle that? And the second thing is, and this you could write a whole book about, which is the DOJ's increasing, role in all of this as it is gotten closer to the intelligence community after 9/11, but now its unusual position inside this administration. And so I'm sure you've given some thought to those, and because our listeners are asking, I'm asking you.
So on China, just briefly, I think there's no doubt about it that China is a huge challenge for the CIA. And China's been unusually successful in rolling up CIA assets in recent years, and that's been kind of an untold story. There's been some New York Times reporting on that, but it's China is coming on strong as a competitor. Everyone knows, and I think that it's a huge challenge for the CIA going forward. Maybe the biggest challenge. As for the DOJ's role, I think that this is a case where I think Gina Haspel has to be really, really careful. The way in which Donald Trump has succeeded in politicizing the top levels of the intelligence community would make Richard Nixon blush. He has really compromised intelligence and politicized it and left many top jobs simply unfilled or empty. And he's installed a partisan sycophant in John Ratcliffe as the director of national intelligence. That makes Gina Haspel's job as the honest broker of intelligence, not only to the president, but to Congress and the American people, that much more difficult and so much more important and critical at this time. And the fact that we have a DOJ investigation led by John Durham that seems specious at best, that seems aimed at trying to prosecute intelligence officers for doing their jobs, is something that Gina Haspel has to be very, very careful about. She really needs to have the backs of her employees, and her record is really mixed on that. I have to say, when Donald Trump threw his intelligence briefer under the bus, saying that the first he'd heard of the virus was on January 23, and that his briefer said it was, quote, no big deal. We all know now her name is Beth Sanner. She evidently, by the way, is on her way out, and it's not at all clear who's going to replace her. Gina Haspel's silence was deafening when Trump threw her under the bus, in my view. I think the CIA director has a responsibility, as I say, to the public. And this was a case where there was so many things wrong with that statement. Everything in the PDB, by definition, is a big deal. And if it is also briefed to the president verbally, it's an even bigger deal. So again, I think this is a perilous time right now for the intelligence community, and an awful lot is riding on Gina Haspel as the honest broker.
So when you look ahead to the future, the November, the short future, like November, and then afterwards, if somebody came to you and said, what are the top 3 recommendations to give the CIA better tools, or less tools, or more restraints, or more clarity, or more of a voice at the table, any of those things, are there anything you would recommend, or would you say, let's just go in this?
Well, it has to start at the top. It has to start in November, because this is not the first time we've had a president who was convinced that the CIA was a deep state full of liberal enemies hell-bent on bringing him down. Richard Nixon thought that about the CIA back in the Helms era, and he thought Dick Helms was this martini-sipping elitist who was out to get him. Nixon was wrong. Trump is wrong. Trump takes it to another level. He's delusional. He believes that the intelligence community, he's compared it to Nazi Germany. He brings a level of contempt for the intelligence community into the presidency that makes it impossible to brief him, makes it impossible for him to have the right information when history-making decisions are made. So the overwhelming priority has to be in November, finding a way to get someone into the Oval Office who respects intelligence and who respects the truth. Because at the end of the day, that's what the CIA does.
So that brings up sort of, I think, like a last substantive question, which is the last election versus this election, and the question of what did we know then and what did we know now? Do you think we learned enough lessons about the interference from the point of view of the intelligence community in 2016 that this election really can be protected one way or another? That's a big question.
We're certainly more aware of the nature of the Soviet threat, and that's obviously an advantage going into this. Having said that, there are always surprises, and in August of 2016, and my book actually opens on this scene. John Brennan is up burning the midnight oil on the 7th floor of CIA headquarters, looking out at the canopy of trees of Langley and trying to figure out what's coming. And he realizes that a Russian attack on the US election is coming. But at that moment in August of 2016, he didn't know about the whole social media component of it. What he knew at that point was that they had hacked into 39 states' electoral machinery, and it later turned out to be 50. So there are those, including Mike Morrell, who said that that's really 2016 was a strategic intelligence failure on the CIA's part, in the sense that they didn't see that extra component of the Russian attack. So we don't know what the Russians may try that's different this time around. We can guess, and obviously they're looking closely. But it's a problem when the president of the United States denies the reality and pretends that it's not happening. It's hard to mobilize a very effective effort to stop a Russian attack. So that would be my answer. It's hard to know. I mean, they have a better idea, but it's hard to know exactly how it'll play out.
So our last question is always the same question, which is, what brings you hope? Which is another question of what brings you hope, yes, and maybe that what brings you hope is the topic of your next book, but what brings you hope?
Well, I do have another book in the works, which I can't really talk about, but would love to come back and talk about someday.
Okay.
This is going to sound a little bit corny, maybe, at the risk of, I have a whole chapter on George H.W. Bush as CIA director, and there was no greater defender of the CIA. He loved that job, as I think everybody knows. But I would say, one of the things that strikes me, having gotten to know a lot of people out there, is that at the end of the day, almost everybody, they're human beings, they have political opinions. There are vast differences between the analysts, who tend to be sun-deprived, geeky intellectuals who are studying, doing their work on paper, and the covert operatives who are out breaking laws in countries all over the world. But the vast majority of them really are very good at keeping their heads down and trying to do their jobs and produce honest intelligence. And they don't pay a lot of attention to whoever is in the Oval Office at any given moment, or any of the bluster that's coming their way. And that may sound Pollyannish and a little bit corny, but you do take some hope away from that when you just see how dedicated most of them are.
So institutional integrity doesn't have to rely on the person on top.
Well, it helps. There's no question about it that it's critical that people at the CIA believe that the CIA director has their backs. The great ones always did. The Leon Panettas, the Bob Gates, others of that kind.
Well, Chris Whipple, thank you for a wonderful conversation. I know the audience has liked this. You can buy this book on the invitation. There's a button that you can push for the link you got today. So you're going to like it. I can tell you that right now. Chris, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Sarah, it was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yep.